Hi everyone, welcome back to Asian Art. In today's lecture I want to talk about Buddhism, a fascinating religion with some extraordinary concepts and ideas that represent some of the oldest art we find in India. While it's true that Hinduism is older than Buddhism, the art that we see, the oldest art we see, is art that has been made with the intent of communicating Buddhism. And it may be that the Buddhist art is just made of materials that has survived longer, and that older Hindu art has not survived. In any case, we see some really extraordinary images and ideas in this class, and we're going to begin our discussion with where they are found in Buddhism. To begin with, there was a person who became known as Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddha, which means the Enlightened One. And Gautama Siddhartha, as his legendary name has been placed, was born sometime in the 5th century BCE. Now, depending on the tradition, whether it's in China or India or somewhere in Southeast Asia, different traditions have different dates for the birth of Buddha. And they cite different texts and evidence for this event. However people parse this moment, it is clear he was a unique individual and one that whose life was recorded, although the record of his life was greatly expanded and elaborated on over the centuries. Some of the core ideas that he expounded were recorded and kept on for all posterity. The story that we know is that he had this miraculous birth. His mother gave birth to him while she was traveling, and on the side of the road you see her here hanging onto the branch of a tree, and here the young Buddha, the Enlightened One, is emerging out of her hip, like from a cesarean section or something like that, this kind of miraculous birth. His mother does not survive, and he is reared in the palace as this sort of prince who is destined to be a great king. The problem is that at age 29, the story goes that he sees these 4 troubling sights: an old man, an ill person, a corpse, and a hermit. And these events, these experiences sort of change his outlook on life and makes him deeply question the sort of life of luxury that he has been living. It makes him want to seek out the true meaning of life. Why do people suffer? Why do people experience these terrible, terrible conditions? And is there any release from this suffering, the condition of suffering, which he sees now everywhere? So he leaves on a journey. He abandons his role as a king, as a Hindu prince. He goes off and becomes a religious leader. He becomes first a monk, where he meditates, seeking to understand the mysteries of life. After a very long journey and almost dying on several occasions from these severe hardships that he has put on himself to try and break through passion and desire, and he realizes that this is not working, that he will die and he will get no closer to understanding the true meaning of the human condition. And so he decides, instead of punishing himself endlessly through what they call mortifications, he instead takes some food, has some rest, and then sits under a tree. And at age 35, he sits there for many days until finally he reaches this enlightenment, this Nirvana. And this is a very important moment in the story of the life of Buddha, that he gained this profound insight into the human condition, and that from this profound insight, he suddenly was no longer attached to this world, that he had the ability to leave at any moment because he had gained this profound insight, this enlightenment on the human condition. And so his nirvana meant that he could have lied down and died, and his spirit would be released. His spirit would not return into corporeal form in another life. It would be a part of the great Godhead beyond death and recycling. And so he realizes, though, that he has a very important thing he can do with this enlightenment, which is to help others. So instead of releasing himself from the world, he goes out and begins life as a teacher. And he begins his teaching over in Sarnath, this town nearby, and from there he gains a following of people who are trying to understand this path toward enlightenment. Here is the Mahabodhi temple in Bodh Gaya today. This is the site where the Bodhi tree can be found. This is believed to be a cutting of the actual tree that he sat under. And this temple has been erected in the 5th and 6th century AD as a commemorative site for that moment. This is a leaf from that tree. I think it's kind of a fig tree that he sat under. So these are the stories we have of the life of Buddha, and they're instructive about the morals and the struggles that he had in gaining enlightenment. Inside those is a kind of kernel of truth that people have been able to identify. Historians have kind of said, well, this is the story that seems to make the most sense from what we actually know. There is no corroborating evidence that there was a prince of the Sakya people named Gautama Siddhartha. Very likely, this Gautama was a person of ordinary birth, and yet he was an extraordinary person who had this amazing insight and eventually did gain quite a following and did impress people to a great degree. And the fact that people took the time to record what he said and took the time to record his life meant that he was really extraordinary, because this is at a time when people didn't think of individual achievements or personal histories as being worthy of being recorded. And so that we have this story of this one person, and this one story of Gautama Siddhartha has stayed with us for all these centuries, other many thousands of years, is a testament to the strength of his character and his ideas. This idea of enlightenment that Gautama Siddhartha would come is that you wanted to achieve a sense of detachment from the world, that you're not buffeted around like a lion not shaking its sounds, like a lotus not smeared by water. This sense of detachment that he was able to extol upon his followers, that you wanted to release yourself from your attachments to this world. And he did this through his teachings. We have a statue here. We see him holding his hands in the sign of a mudra, of teaching, of instruction. Finally, at age 80, he decides he's fulfilled his journey on this earth, and he has what's called the parinirvana, which means he actually does just sort of leave. There's no pain, there's no suffering, there's just a kind of quiet lying down and resting that is a part of this sort of detachment from the world. In this sort of peaceful way, we have these depictions of Gautama Siddhartha, now the Buddha, just lying in rest. His body is cremated, and they knew that his burial site would be important, and it was buried in a stupa. It was sort of separated into maybe a dozen or so places that were important in his life. And so this is where we have the kind of knowledge that is following, and we have a kind of a record of these places where his remains were buried in a mound. This is sort of a commemorate of his achievements in life. So his first teaching, and the one I have you read in perusal, is the Sermon at Deer Park. And in the Sermon at Deer Park, he extols, which are the sort of foundations of Buddhism, what become known as the Four Noble Truths. And so I want to go through these Four Noble Truths and sort of explain some of the sort of basic premise of Buddhist teaching. It starts out in a way that is probably common understanding to most Hindus, especially those who might be Shiva worshippers, that nothing is permanent and that we live in sorrow and suffering, that everything is at a constant state of change. There is nothing permanent. And so this is, in some ways, you could accept this if you understand that, the things of our lives are constantly changing. But for Hindus, there's a sense of a permanent soul. And for Buddhism, they don't have that sense. There's not a sense that there is this kind of self, this thing that's you, that is permanent. Everything, including you, yourself, is also changing. And so this is a very important revelation in Buddhism, is that there is no thing in this world which is sort of static and unchanging. Next, a very important idea is that what causes suffering in this world is our desire for existence in the world, that we want things to last. We want things to stay, and they can't. So our first condition is nothing is permanent, and we put ourselves in a situation of suffering when we are attached to things that cannot last. So we want our cell phone, and yet we drop it in the toilet and it breaks, and there's a sense of we're heartbroken, it's broken, we can't fix it, and so we're attached to things, and because we become attached to things, we feel pain and suffering. You have a pet dog or cat, and of course they grow old, they die, and then we were very attached to them, and then we feel pain and suffering because of those attachments. So the idea that we are attached to things, that we want these things, we want that pet to always be there for us, we feel the loss, and that loss causes this suffering in us. So for Gautama Siddhartha, the idea is to kind of back off from the attachment, to back off from the way in which we are driven to want things to last and to stay and to accept change and not become attached to things. And this is the way in which we will be freed of our desires and end our patterns of suffering. And he suggests one way to eliminate or reduce suffering is by following this eightfold path, which is the sort of right speech, right action, moderation, and kind of not go to excess. Because there was a time when he went to excess. There was a time when he would push himself toward mortification and denying himself things, trying to break through, and he realized that doesn't work. That the best way to achieve enlightenment is through a process of moderation, a process of finding your way without excess. So these are the basic teachings of Buddhism, and it's a very important kind of cornerstone to all of the ideas that what we try and achieve in our lives is not something that happens all at once, but is a long process of moving toward our goals of lessening our attachment to things of this world. Buddhism was one of hundreds of different religions in India at this time. There were lots of people questioning the role of different teachings and different ways of acting in the world. And Buddhism had, a following, but it was by no means a large and popular teaching at this time. It was really with the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, who saw in Buddhism very important ideas that he wanted to bring to all his people in his empire, that he brings Buddhism into the mainstream. He creates this religion that everyone should follow, and he builds it up inside his empire. He takes Buddha's remains and he spreads them over all of northern India, and hundreds of places of worship are built where people can now come and learn of the teachings of Buddha. And so the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, in his revelation, he wanted people to learn about Buddhism through this process of detachment from the world. One of the ways in which we know Ashoka had this design was that he left these edicts, these inscribed stones and pillars that can be found all over his vast empire. And in these edicts, he wrote them down in this ancient Brahmi script. And these were done in a kind of Prakrit, in the kind of local languages of the people. He really wanted to speak directly to the people that he ruled over, which consisted of many different cultures and many different people. And he extolled the virtues of Buddhism and the way in which they could find their way through moderation and prayer. One of the important symbols of Buddhism in Ashoka's empire was these capitals. This is the lion capital carved in sandstone. It's wonderfully highly polished. Now there are 4 lions here. One of them is kind of broken off in the back, but the 4 lions pointing in the 4 different directions would stand on top of a giant pillar. And so for a long ways off, this impressive sight would show everyone that, like the roar of a lion, that sense of Buddhism, it's a powerful royal symbol, but it's also a symbol that is associated with Buddhism. He also has a wheel. The wheel becomes known as the Dharma wheel, the wheel of the teachings of Buddha, that with his words he created this vehicle that we could move toward enlightenment. But the chariot was also a symbol of war, the war chariot, and the wheel was this kind of powerful symbol of military might. So some of the people have suggested that Ashoka was a very wise and astute leader who extolled peace and prosperity among his people, but also had a very firm grip on his rule over his empire. He had one of the largest empires known in India from that time all the way into the modern age. It spread across both the Indus and the Ganges River basins and way up into the Himalayas and way down deep into the southern parts of India. And you can see these red marks all across the map. This is where he had these pillars erected. Now, this production of these pillars was just extraordinary. They believe they were built on site, but the workmen and the technology for making them was probably moved about. And the resources to do this was just being extraordinary. So he was a very wealthy and very powerful ruler who used that power to extol the virtues of Buddhism. Now, after Ashoka, Buddhism begins to change. Initially, what Ashoka taught and promoted was what we call now Theravada Buddhism, which is sort of the original teachings of Buddha. The idea that you join a monastery, you refrain from activities like marriage, and you try and reduce your attachments to the world. That was sort of the basic idea. You study the teachings of Buddha. Mahayana Buddhism, that started a little later, encouraged another idea, and that was that it's not just enough to retreat from the world and to seek your own enlightenment. There is benefit in helping others find their own enlightenment too. So Mahayana Buddhism, Mahayana means the greater path or the greater journey, is this way in which we can help others, and by helping others, we also improve our chances at gaining enlightenment. And the people who help others find enlightenment become known as bodhisattva. So this is a very important idea in Mahayana Buddhism. These are these kind of special sort of enlightened beings who come to help others in their need and help bring them closer to their own enlightenment. Now let's review some of the basic ideas we covered in this lecture. I'm just going to read the questions, and I would like you to take some time and think about the answers on your own. If you're not sure of the answers to any of these questions, I highly recommend you go back and review the lecture again. Question 1. What caste was Gautama Siddhartha? Question 2. What inspired Siddhartha to seek enlightenment? Question 3. How did Emperor Ashoka change Buddhism? Question 4. Where do Buddhists go to seek help on their path to enlightenment? Question 5. What was the role of Ashoka's edicts?